Welcome to Echoes of Jewish History, where memory meets meaning. I'm your host, Jimmy Bitton. Together we'll explore the stories, struggles, and ideas that have shaped the Jewish people across time and around the world. From biblical origins to modern Israel, from exile to resilience, this is our journey. Welcome back to Echoes of Jewish History. Today's episode carries a weight that echoes through centuries. We're not merely recounting mistreatment nor simply revisiting dark chapters in European history. We are entering the architecture of ideas, the theological and cultural frameworks that allowed antisemitism to take root so deeply within Western civilization. This is the story of how a faith tradition born out of Jewish soil came to see the Jew not just as its sibling, but as its shadow. Our focus is Christian antisemitism. But this isn't polemical. This is an inquiry. When we see clearly, when we trace the origins and evolution of dangerous ideas, we make them less likely to sneak back into our present unrecognized. Few thinkers have illuminated this landscape more profoundly than David Nuremberg. In his seminal work, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, Nuremberg argues that the West did not merely oppose Jews, it used Jewishness as a kind of mirror, a metaphor, a necessary other, through which it defined itself. Christianity didn't simply reject Judaism, it reimagined it, repeatedly, as a symbol of everything it believed it had transcended. In this episode, we'll walk through the key pillars of this theological edifice: supersessionism, the belief that Christianity replaced Judaism, the charge of deicide, the accusation that Jews murdered God, the medieval myths that made Jews monsters in the public imagination, the words of figures like Martin Luther, whose sermons sowed seeds of hatred, and finally, how modern Christianity began, slowly, to reckon with its inheritance. This is a story with depth, but also with echoes. These ideas were never just abstract. They shaped law, art, policy, and identity, and their residue lingers. So let's begin at the beginning. A moment of separation, a sibling rivalry, and the long shadow it cast. In the early years of Jesus' death, the early Christian movement was still rooted in Jewish life. Jesus himself was a Jew. His disciples were Jews. They taught in synagogues, honored Jewish festivals, and engaged in the study of Torah. The teachings of Jesus initially moved through Jewish space and Jewish time. But as the movement spread beyond the Jewish world and into the Roman Empire, a question arose. Was this new faith an extension of Judaism or a replacement? The answer arrived in a theological shift that would shape Christian thought for millennia: supersessionism, the idea that the church had replaced Israel as God's chosen people, that the new covenant made at the cross rendered the old one obsolete. We see this in the New Testament itself. The letter to the Hebrews declares, by calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to the people who will produce its fruit. Such verses, read through the lens of history, might seem like metaphors or moments of internal debate. But in the hands of church fathers, they became doctrine. Supersessionism didn't just suggest that Christianity followed Judaism. It insisted that Christianity fulfilled it, perfected it, and in so doing rendered Judaism not just old, but spiritually bankrupt. This shift transformed the image of the Jew. No longer simply a fellow traveler of faith, the Jew became a symbol of resistance, of refusal, a person who clung stubbornly to what had been transcended. Judaism itself became a shadow, and the Jew, a living symbol of spiritual blindness. Jewishness became a metaphor for all that the Christian world sought to leave behind: the body over spirit, law over grace, particularism over universal love. The sermons of John Chrysostom, one of Christianity's most influential theologians, make this clear. In his series of homilies against the Jews, he calls the synagogue brothels, caves of devils, and Jews fit for slaughter. These were not fringe ideas. These were delivered from pulpits, memorized by clergy, inscribed into the marrow of Christian culture. The message was simple and devastating. Judaism was not only mistaken, it was dangerous, a threat to the soul of the church. And once this framing took hold, everything that followed could be justified, not just theologically, but morally. If supersessionism cast Judaism as expired, the doctrine of deicide gave it a curse. At the heart of Christian antisemitism lies one of its most enduring and tragic beliefs, that the Jewish people were responsible for the death of Jesus, for the killing of God. The idea originates in a moment of the Passion narrative in Matthew. When Pontius Pilate offers to release Jesus, the crowd responds, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." That verse, over centuries, was lifted out of context, removed from its historical moment, and transformed into a permanent indictment. No longer about one crowd in one moment, it became about all Jews for all time. Suddenly, an entire people bore the guilt of divine murder, not metaphorically, but literally. And again, this idea did not live at the margins. It was mainstream, repeated by Augustine, preached by countless clergy. Augustine, for all his intellectual brilliance, argued that Jews should not be destroyed, but preserved in suffering. Their humiliation, he wrote, was a living testimony to the truth of Christianity. They were, in his words, the witness people, doomed to wander, degraded, until the end of the days. It was a theology of containment, not death, but degradation. And that theology justified everything that followed: ghettos, expulsions, forced conversions, public shaming, and legal oppression. To be a Jew in Christendom was not simply to be different, it was to be guilty, cursed, and marked. And because the charge of deicide was eternal, no amount of moral behavior, no act of kindness or loyalty could undo it. This was anti-Semitism made sacred. It allowed Christian rulers and commoners alike to believe that their hatred was righteous, and it implanted in the Western mind a reflex to see Jewishness as a moral danger. In the medieval world, Christian anti-Semitism moved from sermon to street. What had been theological became physical. What had been metaphor became myth. Across Europe, Jews were confined to specific quarters. They were barred from owning land, excluded from guilds, and forced into professions deemed impure, like moneylending, usury. Their difference was both legislated and caricatured. But even more disturbing were the myths that began to take hold. Myths that blurred the line between imagination and accusation. The host desecration myth claimed that Jews stole consecrated communion wafers and mutilated them to reenact the crucifixion of Jesus. The blood libel accused Jews of murdering Christian children and using their blood in Passover rituals. These stories were baseless, and they were believed. And belief, when married to fear, becomes a weapon. In 1144, in Norwich, England, a boy named William was found dead. With no evidence, the local Jewish community was blamed. The story spread like wildfire. Soon, similar accusations surfaced in France, Germany, and Spain. Entire communities were destroyed, homes burned, families slaughtered, all in the name of protecting Christian innocence from imagined Jewish cruelty. These myths weren't whispered. They were shouted from pulpits, painted in churches, carved into cathedral walls. Passion plays portrayed Jews as demonic, artworks depicted them with horns and hooked noses. And beneath it all was a moral justification. If the Jew was the Christ killer, the enemy of the church, then violence wasn't cruelty, it was cleansing. David Nuremberg observes, Christianity didn't merely develop a theology of Judaism, it constructed a civilization upon that theology. Children grew up not just with religious instruction, but with images of Jews as villains. The culture breathed suspicion. When economic stress or plague or political instability struck, it was often Jews who were blamed. The myth did not remain medieval. They set the stage for modern conspiracy theories, for Nazi propaganda, persistence of Jewish demonization in literature and film. The theological foundations had birthed a cultural inheritance. With the Protestant Reformation came a flicker of possibility, of hope. Martin Luther, at the beginning of his movement, showed signs of compassion. He criticized the Catholic Church's treatment of Jews and argued kindness. He believed that if Christians preached a pure gospel, Jews might come to embrace it. But when they didn't, Luther's tone turned venomous. In 1543, he wrote, "On the Jews and their lies," a text so filled with hatred that even some of his contemporaries recoiled. He called for the burning of synagogues, the destruction of Jewish homes, and the suppression of rabbis. His words became part of Germany's cultural memory. Centuries later, the Nazis quoted him at their rallies. His language was cited in Nuremberg. His hatred had become a source of national theology. The tragedy is not only that Luther failed, it's that he echoed the very doctrines, supersessionism, deicide, that had already poisoned Christian thought. He could have turned a page. Instead, he reinscribed the text with greater fury. It took the horror of the Holocaust to shake the Christian world into self-reflection. In 1965, the Second Vatican Council issued Nostra Aetate, a revolutionary document. It rejected the deicide charge. It urged dialogue, humility, and respect. This was not a footnote in church history. It was a turning point. Other Christian denominations followed. Confessions were made, liturgies were revised, relationships began to heal. But as Nuremberg reminds us, theology is only part of the story. The deeper current still runs through the culture. Even secular ideologies have framed themselves in contrast to Jewishness. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire saw Judaism as backward. Marx accused Judaism of embodying capitalism. Freud wrestled with his Jewish identity, often ambivalently. In each case, the Jew was used as a metaphor, as caution, as foil. This is anti-Judaism, not as doctrine, but as default. And so the work of healing must continue, not only in churches, but in universities, media, and public discourse. Today, we rarely hear open sermons about deicide or host desecration, but the echoes remain. When conspiracy theories accuse Jews of global control or secret manipulation, that's the blood libel rebranded. When Israel's existence is framed not as political, but as metaphysical evil, that's the deicide motif in national dress. As David Nuremberg warns, anti-Judaism is not just a prejudice, it's a structure, a lens through which the West has learned to interpret itself. To unlearn it requires not only awareness, but new vision. So we carry it, not as a burden, but as a kind of flame. Jewish tradition doesn't ask us to forget. It asks us to remember, zachor. Today's episode may have stirred difficult emotions, but I hope it brought something else, clarity, a grounded awareness. Because to be Jewish is not to be defined by what others said about us. It's to be anchored in what we choose to say and do and build. To anyone listening who has felt a hum of disconnection, a spiritual ache, or just the weight of history, know this: Judaism doesn't promise simplicity. As my dear and departed colleague Chaim Klein, Zichrono Livracha, once said when he looked at his tzitzit, to be Jewish is always to have strings attached, but it promises meaning. And meaning, especially when it echoes through centuries, is what gives shape to our lives. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Echoes of Jewish History. Until next time, may memory strengthen you, and may history never surprise you unprepared. Thank you for listening to Echoes of Jewish History. If this episode brought new insight or raised new questions, I invite you to share it, reflect on it, and continue the conversation. Mostly to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe. I'm Jimmy Bitton, and as always, may our memory lead us to meaning and our past illuminate our path forward.